In the winter of 1951, two boys walked out of the Appalachian wilderness after being missing for 11 days. They were dehydrated, hypothermic, and covered in scratches that didn't look like they came from branches. When the sheriff asked them what happened, the older boy, just 9 years old, said something that made every adult in that room go silent. He said they'd been kept, not lost, kept. And when they asked by who, he looked at his younger brother, then back at the sheriff, and whispered a name no one in that town had spoken aloud in over 30 years. This is the story the Lawson family tried to bury, and after you hear what those boys said, you'll understand why. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Lawson name carries weight in certain parts of North Carolina, but not the kind anyone wants to inherit. If you dig through county records in Stokes County, you'll find a pattern of tragedy that doesn't fit neatly into accident reports or natural causes. It's the kind of pattern that makes old-timers change the subject when you bring it up at the general store. The kind that gets entire branches of a family tree cut out of the local history books. And it all traces back to Christmas Day, 1929, when Charlie Lawson took his family into the tobacco barn and did something so horrific that newspapers across the country refused to print the full details. Charlie murdered his wife and 6 of his children that day, shot them, one by one, methodically. The only survivor was his oldest son, Arthur, who'd been sent into town that morning on an errand that probably saved his life. Charlie then turned the gun on himself. The official story said he'd gone mad, snapped under financial pressure, but Arthur knew something else. Something he whispered to his own children years later, in the dark, when the nightmares got too loud to keep inside. He said his father had been changed in the weeks before the murders, that he'd been going into the woods at night, that he'd come back different, quieter, like something had hollowed him out and was wearing him like a coat. Arthur Lawson raised his family in the shadow of that massacre. He never left Stokes County, never changed his name, even though carrying it was like wearing a target. He had 3 sons of his own. The oldest 2, James and Robert, were the boys who went missing in 1951. They were good boys, according to neighbors, respectful, the kind who did their chores without being asked and didn't cause trouble at school. But Arthur had rules for them that other fathers didn't have for their children. They weren't allowed to play in the woods after dark. They weren't allowed to go near the old Lawson property where the murders happened. And they were never, under any circumstances, supposed to talk to strangers about their grandfather. On January 14, 1951, James and Robert didn't come home from school. It was a Monday, cold enough to see your breath. The school was only 1.5 miles from the house, a straight shot down a dirt road the boys had walked 1,000 times. When they weren't home by supper, Arthur went looking. He found their school books on the side of the road, about halfway home, stacked neatly like someone had set them down on purpose. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leading off into the brush, just the books, sitting there in the fading light, waiting to be found. That's when Arthur called the sheriff, and that's when the town started whispering that the Lawson curse had come back around. The search party that formed that night was smaller than it should have been. In most small towns, when children go missing, every able-bodied man shows up with a flashlight and a sense of duty. But this was different. This was a Lawson. And the men who remembered 1929, who'd seen what Charlie did to his family, they had a superstition about getting involved with that bloodline. Still, about 15 men showed up, including the sheriff, a man named Clayton Oaks who'd been a deputy back when they found Charlie's body in the woods with the rifle still in his hands. Oaks was in his 50s by then, weathered and practical, not the kind of man who believed in curses or ghosts. But even he admitted later, in a conversation that was recorded by a local historian, that something felt wrong about that search from the very beginning. They started where the books were found and worked outward in a grid pattern. Standard procedure. The dogs picked up a scent almost immediately, but then they did something the handlers had never seen before. All 3 hounds stopped at the exact same spot, about 40 yards into the tree line, and refused to go further. They didn't bark or whine. They just sat down, ears back, and stared into the darkness. One of them started trembling so badly the handler thought it was having a seizure. When they tried to drag the dogs forward, all three dug their paws into the frozen ground and pulled back with everything they had. The handlers looked at each other, and then they looked at Sheriff Oakes, and nobody said what they were all thinking. But they felt it. That specific kind of cold that doesn't come from the weather. The search went on for 6 days. They covered over 30 square miles of forest, knocked on doors, checked abandoned buildings and hunting cabins. The state police brought in their own tracking dogs. Same result. The dogs would get to a certain point in the woods and refuse to continue. By day 4, the newspapers had picked up the story. Lawson boys missing, read the headline in the Greensboro Daily News, and underneath, in smaller print, family linked to 1929 Christmas massacre. The reporters started showing up, asking Arthur questions he wouldn't answer, taking pictures of the house, digging up old wounds that had never really healed. One reporter found a retired school teacher who'd taught Charlie Lawson's children before the murders. She told him, off the record, that Charlie had come to the school 3 days before Christmas and pulled his kids out early, said he needed them home for a family portrait. She remembered thinking it was odd because Charlie wasn't a sentimental man. And she remembered the look in his eyes, like he was already saying goodbye. On the 7th day, Arthur received a letter, not in the mail. Someone had slipped it under his front door during the night. There was no stamp, no return address, just his name written on the envelope in handwriting that made his hands shake when he saw it, because he recognized it. It was his father's handwriting. Charlie Lawson had been dead for 22 years, but that was his script, exact and unmistakable. Arthur opened the letter alone in his kitchen while his wife was at the church praying. Inside was a single sentence, written in pencil on a torn piece of notebook paper. It said, "They're learning what I learned. Bring no one." Arthur burned the letter in the stove. He didn't tell the sheriff. He didn't tell his wife. He put on his coat, took his shotgun, and walked into the woods by himself. And that's where this story stops being about a search and starts being about something else entirely. Arthur Lawson found his sons on the 8th day, January 22nd, 1951. He found them in a place he knew he would, though he'd never told a soul it existed. Deep in the woods, past where the search parties had given up, there was a clearing that didn't appear on any map. His father had taken him there once, when Arthur was barely older than his own boys were now. It was summer then, 1928, and Charlie had been different that day. Nervous. He'd made Arthur swear on his mother's life that he'd never speak of that place, never go back, never let his own children near it. Arthur had kept that promise for over 20 years, until the letter came, until he understood that whatever had taken his father had now reached for his sons. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, and nothing grew there. Not grass, not weeds, not even moss on the rocks. The ground was hard-packed dirt, the color of ash, and it felt wrong to walk on, like stepping on something that was aware of your presence. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone structure, barely waist-high, that looked like it might have been a well once, or a cistern, though it was too far from any homestead to make practical sense. James and Robert were sitting beside that structure, backs against the stone, holding hands. They were filthy, their clothes torn, their faces hollow with exhaustion and hunger. But they were alive. When Arthur called out to them, they didn't react at first. They just stared straight ahead, into the trees, like they were watching something he couldn't see. It wasn't until he was 10 feet away that James finally turned his head and looked at his father with eyes that seemed decades older than they'd been 8 days ago. Arthur carried Robert on his back and held James by the hand as they walked out of those woods. The boys didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't ask for water, even though their lips were cracked and bleeding. When they emerged from the tree line, Arthur's wife saw them coming up the road and collapsed to her knees in the front yard, sobbing with relief. The neighbors who'd gathered came running. Sheriff Oakes was called. An ambulance arrived from the county hospital. But Arthur wouldn't let anyone touch his sons until he'd brought them inside the house, drawn every curtain, and locked every door. Only then did he allow the doctor to examine them. The doctor found them dehydrated and malnourished, covered in superficial scratches and bruises, but otherwise physically unharmed. No broken bones, no signs of assault, no explanation for how 2 small boys had survived 8 days in near-freezing temperatures with no food, no water, and no shelter. Sheriff Oakes wanted answers. He sat in the Lawson living room with his notepad and his questions, trying to be gentle because these were children and they'd been through something traumatic. He asked where they'd been. James said they didn't know. He asked who took them. Robert started crying and wouldn't stop until James put a hand over his mouth. Oakes asked if someone had hurt them, if someone had touched them, if they'd been held against their will. James just stared at him for a long moment, then said something that made Oakes write 3 question marks in his notepad and underline them twice. James said, "We weren't taken by a person." Oakes asked what he meant by that. James looked at his father, then back at the sheriff, and said, "It was the same thing that took Grandpa Charlie, and it wanted us to know what he knew." The official report filed by Sheriff Clayton Oakes on January 23, 1951, is 3 pages long and reads like a man trying very hard to write around something he doesn't want to commit to paper. He notes the boys were found by their father in a remote section of forest. He notes they were disoriented and possibly suffering from exposure-induced hallucinations. He notes that despite extensive interviews, no clear explanation for their disappearance could be established. What he doesn't note, but what he told his wife that night, according to her diary, which was donated to the County Historical Society after her death in 1987, was that those boys said things no children should know. Things about the woods, things about what lives in the spaces between trees when no one's watching, and things about Charlie Lawson that were never in any newspaper or police report. The interviews continued over the next 3 days. A child psychologist was brought in from Winston-Salem, a woman named Dr. Margaret Holt, who specialized in trauma cases. She spoke to James and Robert separately, gently, using techniques that were considered progressive for the time. Her notes, which were sealed for 40 years and only declassified in 1991 due to a Freedom of Information request by a researcher, paint a disturbing picture. James told her they'd been walking home from school when they heard singing coming from the woods. Not words, exactly, but a melody that sounded like their grandmother, who died in the massacre. They followed the sound because it felt safe, familiar, like coming home. The last thing James remembered clearly was stepping off the road. After that, everything became fractured, pieces of memory that didn't connect. Darkness, cold, a voice that spoke without sound, and a presence that showed them things. Robert was only 7 years old, and his account was less coherent, more emotional. He told Dr. Holt about a man who wasn't a man, tall and thin, with hands that had too many fingers. He said the man wore his grandfather's face, but the eyes were wrong, set too far apart, and when he smiled, his mouth opened wider than a mouth should open. The man had taken them underground, Robert said, not into a cave, but down through the earth itself, down where the roots go, down where things older than trees wait in the dark. He said his grandfather was there too, or at least part of him was, the part that had survived after the gunshot, and that part was crying, trying to warn them, trying to say he was sorry for what he'd done on Christmas, that he hadn't wanted to kill his family, but the thing in the woods had made him a bargain he couldn't refuse, and when he broke that bargain, it demanded payment in blood. Dr. Holt wrote in her conclusions that the boys were suffering from shared traumatic delusion, likely triggered by hypothermia and their family's dark history. She recommended they be separated for a period of time, sent to stay with different relatives, to prevent them from reinforcing each other's fantasies. But there was a second page to her report, a handwritten addendum that she never submitted officially. In it, she admitted that during her interview with James, something happened that she couldn't explain. The boy was describing the clearing where they were kept when suddenly every window in the room shattered simultaneously. Not cracked, shattered, exploded inward in a spray of glass that somehow didn't cut anyone. And in that moment, Dr. Holt wrote, she heard it too. The singing, faint and far away, coming from somewhere outside, or perhaps somewhere much deeper than outside. A melody that made her think of her own dead mother. And she understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that these boys weren't delusional. They were telling the truth. She left Stokes County that evening and never returned. Her practice records show she stopped taking child trauma cases entirely after 1951. The town wanted to move on. That's what small towns do when something happens that doesn't fit into the comfortable narrative of everyday life. They wanted to call it a miracle that the boys came home, shake their heads about the trauma, maybe send a casserole to the Lawson house, and then never speak of it again. But James and Robert wouldn't let them forget. The boys changed after those 8 days, not in obvious ways at first. They went back to school, they did their homework, they sat in church on Sundays with their hands folded in their laps. But teachers started noticing things. James would stare out the classroom window during lessons, not daydreaming the way children do, but watching, tracking something in the tree line that no one else could see. Robert stopped playing with other kids at recess. He'd stand alone by the fence, perfectly still, his head tilted like he was listening to a conversation happening just below the threshold of hearing, and they both started drawing the same thing, over and over, in the margins of their schoolwork, on scraps of paper, once even on the wall of the boys' bathroom in thick black pencil. A circle, a stone structure in the center, and a tall figure with too many fingers standing at the edge. Arthur knew he had to do something. The whispers were starting again, the same whispers that had followed him his entire life. Lawson curse. Bad blood. Some families are just marked. He couldn't let his sons carry that weight the way he had. So he did what his father should have done back in 1929. He went looking for answers. There was a woman who lived on the outskirts of the county, up a dirt road that didn't have a name, in a house that had been old when the Civil War was young. People called her Aunt Celia, though she wasn't anyone's aunt that could be proven. She was black, which meant most white folks in that area in 1951 crossed the street when they saw her coming. But she had a reputation for knowing things. Old things. The kind of knowledge that gets passed down in whispers, that predates churches and sheriffs and official histories. Arthur had heard his grandmother mention her once, years ago, before the murders. Said Aunt Celia could see the strings that tie people to the land, the debts that get inherited, the contracts signed in desperation that echo through generations. Arthur found her sitting on her porch on a cold February morning, rocking slowly in a chair that creaked with each movement. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She looked at him with eyes that were clouded with age but somehow still sharp, and before he could say a word, she spoke. "Your daddy came to see me," she said. "Month before he killed his family, sat right where you're standing now and asked me how to break a promise made to something that ain't human." Arthur felt his throat tighten. He asked what she told his father. Aunt Celia stopped rocking. "Told him the same thing I'm about to tell you. Some promises don't break. They just change who pays the price. Your daddy thought he could outsmart it. Thought if he gave it what it wanted all at once, the debt would be settled. But that ain't how it works. It just gets hungrier." She told Arthur that the land his family had lived on for 3 generations sat on top of something old, older than the Cherokee who used to avoid that particular valley, older than the trees. There were places, she explained, where the world was thin, where things that lived in the spaces between could reach through if they were called, or if they were offered something they wanted. Charlie Lawson had been desperate during the Depression, crops failing, bank threatening to take the farm. And one night, alone in those woods, he'd made an offering at that stone structure, the one that had been there long before any white settlers arrived. He'd asked for prosperity, for his family to be provided for, and something answered. For a few years, it kept its end of the bargain. The crops improved, money came easier. But the thing wanted more than Charlie had understood he was promising. It wanted lineage. It wanted to taste what it meant to be human, generation after generation. And when Charlie finally understood what he'd agreed to, when he tried to end the contract the only way he knew how, it didn't stop the debt. It just passed it to Arthur, and now it had reached for Arthur's sons. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. Aunt Celia gave Arthur instructions that sounded more like folklore than solution, but he was desperate enough to listen. She told him the thing in the woods fed on acknowledgement. Every time someone spoke about it, thought about it, feared it, they were feeding it. The drawings his boys were making weren't just trauma responses. They were invitations. Doorways. The thing was using James and Robert as bridges, slowly pulling itself further into the world through their memories of those 8 days. If Arthur wanted to save his sons, he needed to sever that connection before it became permanent, before his boys became hollow the way Charlie had been hollow in those final weeks. She gave him a small cloth bag filled with things that made no sense together. Salt, iron filings, a lock of hair she cut from her own head, ash from a fire that had burned for 3 generations in her family's hearth, and she told him to go back to that clearing, alone, at dawn on the new moon. She told him to stand in the center and speak directly to the thing that had marked his family, not to beg, not to bargain, but to offer it something it had never been offered before. The truth. Arthur waited until March 5th, 1951. The new moon fell on a Tuesday. He told his wife he was going hunting and would be back by noon. He told her if he wasn't back by sunset, she should take the boys and leave Stokes County and never come back, never use the Lawson name again. She looked at him like she wanted to argue, but something in his face stopped her. She'd been married to a Lawson long enough to recognize that look, the same look Charlie had worn in those final days. The look of a man walking towards something he couldn't walk away from. Arthur kissed his sons while they slept. James stirred but didn't wake. Robert whispered something in his sleep that sounded like too many fingers, and Arthur had to leave the room before he lost his nerve. The walk to the clearing felt longer than it had before. The woods were silent in that unnatural way that makes experienced hunters uneasy. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, just his boots on frozen earth and his breath in the cold air. When he reached the clearing, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky the color of a healing bruise. The stone structure sat in the center exactly as he remembered, exactly as his sons had drawn it 100 times. Arthur stood before it and emptied the contents of Aunt Celia's bag in a circle around himself. The salt and iron filings and ash formed a thin barrier that looked ridiculous and inadequate, but he'd come too far to doubt now. He spoke aloud, his voice shaking at first, then growing steadier. He said his father's name. He said his sons' names. And then he said the thing he'd never admitted to anyone, not even himself, that he'd always known, that some part of him had understood since he was a boy that his family was marked, that they'd been marked since before he was born, and that the massacre on Christmas Day 1929 wasn't madness, it was payment. The thing answered, not with words, but with presence. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe. The light bent wrong, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. And then it was there, at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line. Arthur couldn't look at it directly. His eyes wouldn't focus on it properly. It was tall and thin and wore shapes the way a person wears clothes, trying them on and discarding them. For a moment it looked like his father. Then it looked like himself. Then it looked like something that had never been human and never would be. It asked Arthur, without sound, what he was offering. Arthur told the truth. He said he had nothing left to give. No bargains to make. No deals to strike. He was empty. His father had paid. He himself had paid in fear and shame every day of his life, and he would not let his sons pay. The debt, he said, ends with me. Whatever you want, take it from me, but you leave my boys alone. What happened next in that clearing was never fully recorded, because Arthur Lawson never spoke of it in detail. Not to his wife, not to his sons, not even to Aunt Celia when he returned to thank her 3 days later, walking with a limp he hadn't had before and a streak of white hair at his temple that appeared overnight. But the change was immediate and undeniable. James and Robert stopped drawing the circles. They stopped staring into the woods. The hollow look faded from their eyes over the course of weeks, like color returning to a photograph that had been left too long in the sun. They became children again, the way children are supposed to be. Loud and messy and focused on things like baseball and comic books and whether they'd get dessert after dinner. They didn't speak about the 8 days they'd been missing, and after a while, it seemed like they didn't remember them at all, the way the mind protects itself by burying what it cannot process. Arthur, on the other hand, grew quieter as the years went on. Neighbors said he aged faster than a man should, like something was consuming him from the inside at a steady, measured pace. He developed a habit of walking the property line at dusk, always alone, as if he were standing guard against something only he could see. His wife would watch him from the kitchen window, and sometimes she'd see him stop and turn toward the woods, his head tilted in that same listening posture Robert had once had, and she'd feel a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. But the boys grew up healthy. James became a mechanic. Robert became a teacher. They both married, had children of their own, moved away from Stokes County but not so far that they couldn't visit. And the Lawson curse, the one that had hung over the family like smoke since 1929, seemed to finally lift. Arthur Lawson died in 1968, at the age of 54, which was younger than it should have been but not so young that it raised questions. The official cause of death was heart failure. He was found in his workshop behind the house, slumped in his chair, tools still in his hands like he'd simply decided to stop mid-project. But his face, according to the funeral director who prepared the body, had an expression of profound relief, like a man who'd been carrying something impossibly heavy for years and had finally been allowed to set it down. At the funeral, James and Robert stood together beside the casket, and for just a moment, James felt something, a flicker of memory, cold ground beneath him, a voice without sound, his father's face in the clearing, backlit by dawn, speaking words James couldn't quite recall, and then it was gone, slipping away like a dream upon waking. The clearing still exists, though it's harder to find now. The forest has grown denser over the decades, and the old logging roads that once provided access have been reclaimed by undergrowth and time. But if you know where to look, if you have the old county maps from before they redistricted the area in the 70s, you can still find it. The stone structure is still there, half buried now, covered in moss and lichen. Nothing grows in that circle of ash-colored earth. Hunters avoid it without knowing why. Dogs won't go near it. And on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the air is still, people who live in the hollers nearby will tell you they hear singing in the woods. Not words, exactly, but a melody that sounds familiar, like someone you loved once, calling you home. The smart ones don't follow it. They close their windows, lock their doors, and wait for dawn. Because they know what the Lawson family learned across 3 generations. Some debts don't die with the people who made them. They just wait, patient and hungry, for the next name to be spoken aloud in the dark. The story of James and Robert Lawson, and what they told investigators in 1951, never made national news. It was buried in local records, dismissed as trauma and superstition, the kind of story that doesn't fit the shape of modern rationality. But it's there, if you're willing to look, in the sheriff's reports, with their careful omissions, in Dr. Holt's sealed notes, in the memories of old families who remember when the Lawson name meant something other than tragedy, and in the careful silence of James and Robert themselves, both still alive as of this recording, both in their 80s now, both refusing every interview request, every researcher who comes calling with questions about those 8 days. They know what their father knew, that some stories survive best when they're not told, that some truths are safer buried, and that the woods are always watching, always waiting, always hungry for someone foolish enough to listen when the singing starts.